June 3, 1937. Château de Candé, Loire Valley, France. The chateau itself was borrowed, a converted castle made available by a Franco-American businessman named Charles Bedaux, because no British official would offer anything more dignified. The guest list ran to roughly 20 people. No member of the British royal family attended, not a single one. The groom was 42 years old, a former king, now styled the Duke of Windsor. Time magazine's correspondent, watching the scene unfold, noted that as the bride walked toward him, the Duke stood hollow-eyed. The bride was Wallis Simpson, 41 years old, twice divorced, originally from Pennsylvania, and for the 18 months preceding this ceremony, the most publicly despised woman in the English-speaking world. She wore a Mainbocher gown in a shade the fashion press described as Wallis blue, a pale cornflower color that Mainbocher's studio had mixed specifically for her, as if the world needed a new color named after this particular disaster. He had given up a throne for her. She wrote to her previous husband on the honeymoon, "I think of us so much, though I try not to." That letter, addressed to Ernest Simpson, the London businessman she had divorced to be with Edward, isn't a romantic detail. It's the central document of everything that follows. The fairy tale version of this story ends at the abdication. This story begins the morning after. Edward's famous broadcast ran on December 11, 1936. His voice, carrying through radio receivers across Britain, across the Commonwealth, across America, declared it impossible to discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love. In a single speech, a constitutional crisis became a love story. The romance was retroactively installed as the reason for everything: the abdication, the exile, the sacrifice. The world needed it to be a love story because a love story, unlike a constitutional crisis, has a satisfying shape. Boy gives up everything for girl. They live abroad. The end. The very first thing that actually happened after the abdication was a piece of legal paperwork designed to humiliate the woman he had supposedly done all of this for. On May 27, 1937, King George VI issued letters patent confirming that his brother would hold the style of His Royal Highness, Duke of Windsor. The wording had been constructed with deliberate precision to prevent the title from extending to the Duke's wife. Wallis Simpson married the Duke of Windsor on June 3rd. Under any normal application of royal protocol, she would have become Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Windsor, automatically upon marriage. Under the letters patent, she didn't. She was technically the Duchess of Windsor in name, no HRH. No royal status. Every courtier, every aristocrat, every visiting dignitary was technically correct in refusing to curtsy to her, and most of them exercised that right with visible relish. The distinction wasn't merely ceremonial. It structured the entire social reality of their lives in exile. Invitations were calibrated around it. Visits to embassies became exercises in calculated protocol management. The women who attended their Paris dinner parties knew exactly what they were and weren't required to do when they entered the room. Some of them curtsied anyway, as a gesture of courtesy. Some of them emphatically didn't. The Windsors tracked both categories. Edward would spend the next 35 years furious about it and lobbying unsuccessfully for its reversal. George VI ordered courtiers to avoid them entirely. Queen Mary, the formidable matriarch who had raised Edward and who outlived him, declined to receive Wallis until her own death in 1953. The phrase that circulated in London drawing rooms was, "Death by 1,000 snubs." Emerald Cunard, once one of Wallis's close London social allies, publicly disowned her during the abdication crisis, announcing to anyone who asked that she had never actually met Wallis Simpson. Cunard had been in Wallis's home multiple times. The finances were managed through a set of arrangements designed to keep Edward's income contingent on his remaining abroad. George VI paid his brother £25,000 per year, structured against the transfer of Edward's interests in Balmoral and Sandringham. Treasury documents released in 2003 revealed the full picture of the royal private estate transfers involved. The arrangement wasn't simply a family stipend, it was a mechanism. A subsequent account, by Andrew Loney, documented that Edward had represented his financial circumstances to his brother as considerably more straitened than they actually were, having assets substantially in excess of what the arrangement implied. Whatever the precise mechanics, the practical reality was that England had nothing to offer the Windsors except their private income and the social machinery of exile. When the war came, that exile was formalized into an assignment. Edward was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1940, a posting that kept him simultaneously occupied and irrelevant, separated from Europe and from any proximity to the Nazi contacts that Churchill was working actively to conceal. The Marburg files captured German Foreign Office documents revealing that the Nazi leadership had planned to use Windsor as a puppet monarch during a projected invasion of Britain, were suppressed by Churchill for decades. The Windsors remained in Nassau for roughly 5 years. Wallis organized charities, Edward reviewed troops. Then the war ended, and there was no pretext for keeping them productively occupied, and they came back to France. In 1953, they moved into 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, a property situated on the northwest edge of the Bois de Boulogne in Paris's 16th arrondissement. The city of Paris leased it to them at a nominal rent, an arrangement that persisted until Wallis's death. She redesigned the interiors through Maison Jansen, one of the most prestigious Parisian decorating firms of the era, the same firm that had worked on the White House. The result was immaculate in the specific way that exile interiors tend to be immaculate. Every object placed with the care of people who have nothing more urgent to occupy their attention. Royal furniture, precise arrangements, a house that looked, to visitors, like a museum that served dinner. The staff called it by its address. The name Villa Windsor was applied later, by someone else. Before any account of what their life looked like from the outside, the interior logic needs to be established. The mechanism that made the cage, and why it was built from devotion rather than bars. By late 1934, before the abdication, before any public knowledge of the relationship, Edward's equerry, John Aird, had written in his diary, "The prince follows W around like a dog." This was the observation of a man whose professional function was to manage Edward's movements, and who recorded what he saw without editorial purpose. By that point, according to Edward's official biographer, the future king had already become slavishly dependent on Wallis. Drawn not despite her sharp, domineering manner and her blunt irreverence toward his position, but because of it. She treated him like an ordinary person, capable of ordinary accountability. He found this irresistible. The problem was what irresistible meant in practice. Historian Cecilia Borman, speaking for a Smithsonian Channel documentary, described Edward's affection toward Wallis, even after the wedding, even during their decades in Paris, as clingy and cloying. He wanted her in his company at all times. He grew demonstrably jealous if she spoke at length to any other man at the parties they attended together. He wrote to her multiple times daily, sometimes 3 letters in a single day, in a register that does not read as passion so much as sustained emotional emergency. One letter from the period conveys the tone. He was dippy to die with her, even if they couldn't live together. He sent jewelry during their separations. Among the pieces, a Van Cleef & Arpels ruby and diamond bracelet inscribed simply with the words, "Hold tight." That instruction, "Hold tight," was itself a kind of confession. He wasn't giving her jewelry. He was giving her a directive. Warman's formulation for what this produced in Wallis is worth sitting with. This suffocating behavior actually drove her from him. Not the narrative of fading devotion that appears in the softer versions of this story. His love diminishing, the relationship cooling over decades, the fairy tale turning gradually gray. The opposite. His love never diminished. It increased, if anything, in the intensity that specific absence of reciprocation can generate. The tragedy for Wallis wasn't that Edward stopped loving her. It was that he never did, and the immensity of what he had done for that love meant she could never say so clearly. Wallis's own letters from the abdication period, recovered from a private archive and authenticated by biographer Anne Seba, document a woman in something closer to controlled panic than romantic ecstasy. Writing to Ernest Simpson in October 1936, with the crisis gathering around her, "I am terrified of the court." And separately, "I feel small and licked by it all." To Herman Rogers, the confidant who had counseled her to simply accept her notoriety. "But it's getting me down. It makes me feel cheap. It makes me feel disreputable." These weren't the private letters of a woman orchestrating a seduction. They were the letters of someone watching a situation they had not engineered accelerate past any point of control. She tried to end it, and the record of her attempts is documented. Her solicitor, John Theodore Goddard, stated publicly in December 1936 that his client was ready to do anything to ease the situation, that she was prepared to give Edward up entirely. She issued a public statement signaling her readiness to withdraw from the relationship. She reportedly called Edward a fool when he confirmed the abdication was done. What she couldn't control was the specific mechanism that locked the cage from the inside. Edward had made explicit that he would kill himself if she left. She had to deceive him about her own whereabouts, what Seba's archive documents as telling him the old search for hat story, to create any separation at all. His fragility was the architecture of her imprisonment. Once he abdicated, Seba's summary is the most precise formulation available. She was stuck. The logic was airtight. She had not wanted this. She had tried to prevent it. A man had now destroyed his kingship for her, threatened his own life to keep her close, and had no remaining identity apart from being the person who had done that extraordinary thing. Leaving wouldn't simply end a marriage. It would retroactively render the abdication meaningless, destroy whatever remained of Edward's psychological stability, and almost certainly end his life. She couldn't leave. She had never chosen to stay. She remained. Diana Cooper, a direct observer who saw Wallis and Edward together in August 1936, recorded her impression in terms that corroborate the private letters. Cooper wrote that Wallis didn't want to be left alone with the king, and concluded that she's bored stiff with him, and her picking on him and her coldness towards him, far from policy, are irritation and boredom. That observation predates the abdication. Before the empire for love sacrifice, before the weight became permanent, the boredom and irritation were already there when she had nothing more consequential to be bored by. The honeymoon letter, the one to Ernest, makes the same point in a single sentence. Anne Seba's research found other letters written by Wallis during the Windsor courtship that suggest she and Ernest shared a private emotional language of intimacy that she explicitly didn't share with Edward. She used invented lovers' terms she and Ernest had developed together, and used them in letters mocking Edward's behavior. The mockery was gentle, perhaps, but it was there. She was processing Edward with her previous husband in the vocabulary of their actual intimacy. Nothing else in Edward's life gave him any sense of achievement, as Seba documents. The marriage was his entire meaning. For Wallis, the slavish devotion was an obligation she couldn't set down, and couldn't acknowledge, and couldn't escape. This was the texture of the life they built together in Paris. They entertained constantly, lavishly, and with the precision that Wallis's obsessive attention to domestic arrangement demanded. The Villa Windsor's dining room was maintained to an exactingly specific standard: the table settings, the flowers, the menu sequencing. Wallis supervised all of it. She had nothing else to supervise. The Windsors' social set rotated through wealthy expatriates, international socialites, American money. Anyone from the right circles who made the trip to Paris and accepted the invitation. Edward moved through these evenings as the former King of England, recognized, formally addressed, treated with a kind of reflexive deference that no longer attached to any actual authority. His official biographer summarized it plainly. Here the Duke had nothing to do except rehearse his grievances and yearn for an end to his exile. The parties weren't pleasure. They were structured occupation for people with no other structure available. The Windsors' position was one of the stranger social phenomena of the 20th century, the most famous non-entities in the world. Recognized everywhere, welcome nowhere that retained institutional weight. Every foreign dignitary knew who they were. No foreign government extended them anything beyond social courtesy. The British government had no role to offer. The Commonwealth wanted nothing to do with them. They attended parties, hosted parties, traveled to their properties in the south of France, and returned to the house on the edge of the Bois de Boulogne to do it again. In October 1937, 5 months after the wedding, the accumulated hunger for recognition produced what became a propaganda coup for the Nazi regime. The Windsors visited Germany from October 11th to 22nd. The itinerary included meetings with Adolf Hitler, Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer. Edward and Hitler held a private conversation lasting over an hour. The transcript has never surfaced and is presumed destroyed. After returning to France, Edward wrote Hitler a thank you letter stating that the trip made a great impression on us. He returned Nazi salutes from crowds as they traveled through the country, the gesture documented in multiple photographs. The visit fulfilled the Windsors' short-sighted hunger for the grand royal treatment they had been denied everywhere else. Wallis received curtsies and bows in Germany that had been refused to her by every institution she had encountered. The country whose government was, at that moment, constructing the apparatus of industrialized murder was more willing to treat her as royalty than the country whose king had given up everything for her. She stood in a room with Göring and received the deference Britain had refused to grant. The reputational damage from those 2 weeks followed the Windsors for the rest of their lives and provided the intelligence services of multiple allied nations with sufficient cause to treat Edward as a security liability for the duration of the war. Churchill spent years managing the consequences of a private trip that lasted 11 days. The letters published in 1988, drawn from the Windsor private correspondence, revealed a 30-year feud with the royal family, whose bitterness was striking even given its context. Edward referred to his relatives as a seedy, worn-out bunch of old hags. The phrase has the quality of something repeated so often in private that it had lost its edge. The resentment ran in both directions across 3 decades and was documented on both sides. Through all of it, the interiors of the villa stayed perfect. Wallis decorated and redecorated and arranged and rearranged. She threw dinner parties that her guests remembered as exemplary. She maintained the wardrobe of a woman who was still, by the standards of Paris fashion circles, a figure of consequence. She was photographed. She gave occasional interviews. In 1970, she and Edward gave a BBC interview, one of their last public appearances together. That was notable primarily for how comprehensively each of them avoided saying anything of substance. She was the Duchess of Windsor, and she had no idea what to do with that except perform it, year after year, in a house that looked like a crown no one was wearing. Edward was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1971. He underwent cobalt therapy in France. The treatment didn't work. By the spring of 1972, he was dying in the house they had shared since 1953, in a bedroom off the garden, tended by nurses whose names he couldn't always remember. On May 18, 1972, Queen Elizabeth II arrived at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement as part of a state visit to France. It was her first visit to their Paris home in the 35 years since the abdication. The first time she had come to them. The BBC reported the occasion with the specific headline, "Duke too ill for tea with the Queen." Edward was dying upstairs. Wallis received the Queen, who had spent her uncle's widowhood refusing him the one thing he consistently asked her to grant his wife. The visit lasted a short while. What passed between Wallis and Elizabeth during those hours isn't documented in ways that can be considered authoritative. 10 days later, on May 28, 1972, at approximately 2:25 in the morning, Edward died. He was 77 years old. The official Buckingham Palace statement said he died peacefully. On his deathbed, he had reportedly asked Queen Elizabeth to grant Wallis the HRH designation, the title she had been denied since the letter's patent of 1937. The Queen refused. She refused the final request of the man who had given up her family's throne for precisely this woman, on the specific question of whether that woman deserved one particular honorific. The answer was no. The title Wallis Simpson never held in life wasn't extended in death, not at his request, not as a deathbed gesture. Britain's position, maintained without interruption since May 1937, held through his final hours. Edward's body was returned to Britain and lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Wallis attended the funeral. Contemporary accounts describe her as frail and visibly disoriented, a woman of 75 who had spent the prior several months watching the fixed axis of her existence slowly disappear. She had structured 35 years around one man's consuming, daily, absolute need for her presence. At the funeral, observers noted she appeared confused, as though the mechanics of public grief had come apart in her hands. What remained after the burial wasn't freedom. It was a specific variety of wreckage that has no better name, no country to return to. The royal family had not received her during the exile, and wouldn't receive her now. Her English social connections, never extensive given 3 decades of Parisian life, had aged and contracted. No official identity beyond widow of a duke who had himself been officially invisible for decades. She was the most famous widow in the world, and she had nowhere to go, and no one whose survival depended on hers. She fell out of bed at Christmas 1972. The severity of the injury wasn't recognized for weeks. Suzanne Bloom was born on November 24, 1898, in the French town of Niort. She joined the Paris bar in 1922 and spent the next 4 decades building one of the most formidable legal reputations in the country. Her client list reads like a directory of mid-century Hollywood: Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, MGM, Charlie Chaplin, Walt Disney. She represented Rita Hayworth in her 1952 divorce from Prince Ali Khan, negotiating what was described at the time as the record divorce settlement of its era. She had handled the interests of very famous and very wealthy people for most of her professional life, and she was exceptionally good at it. She came to the Windsors through her husband, Paul Weil, who had served as the Duke's Paris attorney. When Weil died in 1965, Bloom continued the representation. While Edward was alive, she remained in the background, present, useful, professionally available, but not central. The primary legal work for the Windsors in England was handled by Allen and Overy, a London firm. This arrangement changed after Edward's death. Allen and Overy was terminated by 1973. Bloom's authority became exclusive. She was now the sole legal representative of an increasingly isolated, increasingly frail, increasingly confused elderly woman whose household had always depended on masculine authority to organize it, and who had just lost the only masculine authority in her life. The timeline of what followed is documented most comprehensively in Hugo Vickers' 2011 book, Behind Closed Doors: The Tragic, Untold Story of the Duchess of Windsor. Vickers' account runs as follows. In 1975, John Utter, a key member of the Windsor household staff, officially retired. The word officially is doing work in that sentence. In April 1978, Johanna Schutz, who had served as Wallis's secretary, was dismissed on Bloom's stated grounds of instability and frequent absences. Sources close to the household noted that Schutz was, in fact, far from unstable. Her departure was the final staffing change that completed the process. Before her, Sir Godfrey Morley, the British lawyer who had also been involved in the Windsor affairs, was removed after Bloom had reportedly persuaded the increasingly confused Duchess that Morley was attempting to access her money. Each dismissal had an individual explanation. None of them were individually implausible. Viewed in sequence, they constitute something else: the systematic removal, over approximately 5 years, of every person in Wallis's immediate circle whose loyalty was to Wallis rather than to Blum. The financial activity ran in parallel with the staff removals. In August 1977, Blum facilitated the sale of items from the Windsor household to Estée Lauder for $150,000. The transaction was documented in Vickers' research and was conducted under Blum's authority rather than any demonstrably explicit consent from Wallis. In May 1977, Blum had taken items from the residence described in secondary accounts as rubies, emeralds, diamonds, and personalized jewelry inscribed from the Duke. The jewelry requires specific attention because it wasn't simply valuable, it was biographical. Wallis Simpson's collection had been assembled over decades, much of it given by Edward during their courtship and marriage. Pieces whose inscriptions recorded specific moments, whose design reflected specific occasions, whose existence was the material evidence of their life together. Each piece had a date, a context, a person attached to it. The Van Cleef & Arpels ruby and diamond bracelet inscribed, "Hold Tight," sent during a separation in the 1930s, wasn't just a bracelet. It was a 40-year-old artifact of a specific morning when a man who would shortly give up a throne was desperately trying to hold on to the woman he was convinced he needed to survive. Selling these pieces without documented consent wasn't simply a financial transaction. It was a systematic erasure of the physical record of a life. In September 1977, Wallis Simpson, then 81 years old, experiencing memory lapses but not yet entirely silenced, summoned what appears in retrospect to have been her last act of clear will. She shouted at Bloom, "I hate you!" After that confrontation in the account preserved in secondary sources and cited in Vickers' research, Bloom did exactly as she pleased. That sentence is worth holding. The last documented verbal resistance Wallis Simpson ever offered to anything happened in a private confrontation with her lawyer, 8 years before she died, and the consequence of her resistance was the confirmation that it made no difference. By the spring of 1978, Wallis had ceased speaking entirely. By autumn of that year, she had lost use of her hands and feet. She had to be carried from her bed to a clinical couch. She no longer communicated. She had, by every functional definition, ceased to exist as an agent in her own life. Bloom, simultaneously, launched a public campaign on Wallis's behalf, attacking Thames Television's dramatized series Edward and Mrs. Simpson, publicly disclosing the existence of Windsor love letters, quoting one to the Evening Standard. "Give up this mad idea. "It's impossible. It will be a disaster." Issuing statements about the Duchess's wishes, defending her interests, Bloom explained, against those who would intrude on her dignity and disturb her peace. She described herself as the defender of the moral rights and interests of the Duchess of Windsor. The woman whose moral rights and interests she was defending couldn't speak, couldn't move under her own power, couldn't receive visitors without Bloom's specific permission, and couldn't contradict any public statement made in her name. Hugo Vickers, whose research is the most sustained examination of this period available, described Bloom as Satan in tweeds, a characterization that has defined the historiography of Wallis's final years. The Foxed Quarterly's review of his book captures the evidential situation precisely. Vickers tells us that no written evidence was ever produced to prove that the Duchess, confused, mute, and incapacitated, had authorized the major financial transactions conducted in her name. The Guardian's reviewer, while broadly accepting the evidence of exploitation, noted that Vickers's personal hostility toward Bloom may have colored aspects of his presentation. That observation is fair. What it does not affect is the documented sequence. Wallis couldn't consent by the late 1970s, and transactions were conducted throughout that period in her name. Robin Baer, a distinguished plastic surgeon who had known Wallis previously, also managed an authorized visit. According to accounts documented in Vickers' research, Bloom ensured that Wallis was sedated before Baer arrived, so that she couldn't communicate anything to him. He came in regardless. He sat with her. The only indication that she recognized him at all was a single tear rolling down her cheek. One tear. From a woman who had spent decades as the most discussed person in the English-speaking world, who had worn inscribed bracelets from Van Cleef and Arpels and been photographed by every major publication in Europe and America and been received by Hitler and refused recognition by the British Crown, and hosted elaborate dinner parties in a Maison Johnson interior, and written letters that called herself cheap and disreputable, and had once, in September 1977, managed to shout out her final coherent opinion at the top of her lungs. By the early 1980s, recognition looked like a single tear rolling down a cheek in a house she couldn't leave, surrounded by things that were disappearing. The journalist who went looking for the reality behind Bloom's public facade was Caroline Blackwood, a novelist and journalist commissioned in 1980 by the Sunday Times to write a piece on the aging Duchess of Windsor. The assignment seemed routine. The Duchess was said to be convalescing. Blackwood would visit, conduct an interview, and file a profile. What she encountered instead was Bloom functioning as total and aggressive gatekeeper, making access to Wallis entirely contingent on Bloom's own cooperation, which wasn't forthcoming. Blackwood found an 83-year-old Bloom who had become, in Blackwood's eventual description, vitriolic in her management of access. Old friends of the Windsors confirmed to Blackwood that they had been prevented from visiting Wallis for years. The story Blackwood assembled, from these second-hand accounts, from her encounters with Bloom herself, from what could be reconstructed of the Duchess's actual condition, wasn't a profile piece. It was something considerably darker. A reconstruction of an elderly woman held incommunicado while her estate was liquidated by the person ostensibly protecting her. Blackwood wrote the book. She called it The Last of the Duchess, the strange and sinister story of the final years of Wallis Simpson. Bloom threatened legal action. The manuscript was held. For years, it existed in a kind of legal suspension, suppressed by the threat of litigation from a woman who claimed the right to silence reporting about a person who could no longer speak for herself. Blackwood couldn't publish it while Bloom was alive. Bloom was alive until January 23, 1994. She died aged 95. The Last of the Duchess was published in 1995. The New York Times review noted that Blackwood's greatest scorn in the book was reserved for Bloom, described in its pages as necrophiliac and ruthless. Critics who found fault with the book argued that Blackwood relied too heavily on speculation in the absence of direct access to Wallis herself. That critique isn't entirely unfair. What Blackwood could document were the outlines of the isolation, the staff removed, the friends blocked, the incapacitated woman managed through an intermediary who simultaneously controlled the financial transactions and the public narrative. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement, Paris. She was 89 years old. The house she had moved into in 1953, the house Maison Johnson had redesigned to her specifications, the house she had spent 30 years maintaining to an exacting standard, was the house she died in a room she had not left under her own power for years. No member of the British royal family had visited her there since Queen Elizabeth's brief appearance in May 1972. The British establishment that had refused to grant her a title for 49 years of marriage wasn't present at the end. After her death, Bloom released the Windsor love letters to publication. She admitted that she profited from the royalties for her time and assistance in facilitating the release, which she characterized as Wallis's wish. Whether Wallis, who had been mute and immobile for years before her death, had expressed any such wish in any recoverable form isn't documented. In 1987, the year after Wallis's death, Sotheby's held an auction of the Duchess of Windsor's jewelry collection in Geneva. The collection was divided into 305 lots. The proceeds were directed to the Institut Pasteur in Paris. Each of those 305 lots was once a specific piece with a specific history: a date, a giver, an occasion, an inscription. The Van Cleef & Arpels bracelet that said, "Hold tight." The rubies and emeralds that Bloom had characterized as gifts when she removed them from the villa in May 1977. The physical record of 50 years, dispersed across 305 auction lots to the highest bidder, the proceeds going to a medical research institute that had no connection to anything Wallis Simpson had ever cared about. On April 29, 1986, 5 days after her death, Wallis Simpson was buried at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Berkshire, England, beside Edward, in the country that had never wanted her. The specific arithmetic of what that means runs as follows. The letters patent denying her the HRH designation were issued in May 1937. She died in April 1986. That is 49 years of official, non-royal status. 49 years in which every courtier had the institutional sanction to refuse her recognition, and most of them used it. 49 years in which Edward fought unsuccessfully for the reversal. 49 years in which the position of the crown remained exactly what it had been on the day George VI crafted language precise enough to exclude one specific woman from one specific honorific. She was buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, in the consecrated earth reserved for members of the dynasty and their families, with the full ceremonial weight of the institution that had spent her adult life making clear she didn't belong to it. The woman Britain refused to make a royal in any legal sense was buried with the honors of one when she was no longer capable of knowing it had happened. She couldn't feel the irony. She couldn't receive the acknowledgement. She couldn't have any reaction at all to the institution finally, quietly, relenting. The greatest love story of the 20th century ended at a graveside in Berkshire, attended by people who had spent decades refusing her, beside the man whose love had functioned from the moment he signed his name to those abdication documents on December 10, 1936, as the walls of the cage she lived in for 35 years. And after those walls came down, in the specific form of a death at 2:25 in the morning in Paris in May 1972, what replaced them was Bloom. Wallis Simpson was never a queen. She paid for everything anyway. paid in the currency of 35 years without a country, 49 years without a title, a marriage to a man whose devotion she couldn't reciprocate and couldn't escape, and a final decade in a house being emptied around her while she could no longer say a word about any of it. She was buried with royal honors on April 29, 1986, in Berkshire, England. She had been trying to leave since 1936. Subscribe for more stories like this.